August 2nd, 1343, Paris, France. A noblewoman named Jeanne de Clisson receives devastating news. Her husband Olivier has been executed by order of King Philip VI, his head displayed on a pike as a traitor, despite being innocent. Most women of her era would have wept, mourned, and accepted their fate. Jeanne did something entirely different. She sold everything she owned, bought 3 warships, painted them black as symbols of mourning and vengeance, and became one of history's most terrifying pirates. For 13 years, she hunted French ships across the English Channel, personally executing every French nobleman she captured, leaving only 1 or 2 survivors to carry her message back to the king. This is the story of Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany, a woman who transformed grief into terror, who built a private navy powered by revenge, and who proved that a scorned woman could bring an entire kingdom to its knees. Jeanne de Belleville was born around 1300 into one of Brittany's most distinguished noble families, inheriting wealth, status, and all the privileges that came with aristocratic birth in medieval France. Brittany in this period was a semi-independent duchy on France's northwestern coast, a region with its own customs, loyalties, and complex political relationships with both the French crown and the English kingdom. The Belleville family controlled substantial lands and commanded respect throughout the region, making Jeanne's childhood one of comfort and security that prepared her for marriage to another noble family. She married young, as was customary for noblewomen in the 14th century, entering into strategic alliances designed to strengthen family power and consolidate landholdings. Her first 2 marriages ended with her husband's deaths, not unusual in an era of endemic warfare, disease, and relatively short life expectancies, even among the wealthy. These early marriages brought her children and additional lands, expanding her wealth and status, but they apparently weren't particularly remarkable emotionally. Jeanne was fulfilling her expected role as a noblewoman, marrying for practical and political reasons rather than for love. Everything changed when she met Olivier de Clisson, a Breton nobleman who would become her 3rd husband and the love of her life. Olivier was a powerful figure in Brittany, controlling substantial territories and commanding military forces in the complex political landscape of the region. He was intelligent, brave, well-regarded among Breton nobility, and apparently genuinely devoted to Jeanne in ways that her previous marriages hadn't been. Their marriage, which occurred around 1330, was both a political alliance and a genuine love match, a rare combination in an era when noble marriages were typically arranged for strategic rather than romantic reasons. Jeanne and Olivier's life together was prosperous and seemingly secure. They controlled vast estates, lived in comfort appropriate to their status, raised children from Jeanne's previous marriages and children they had together. They participated in Breton political life, maintained connections with other noble families, and navigated the complex loyalties that characterized the region. Brittany's position between France and England meant that Breton nobles constantly had to balance relationships with both kingdoms, maintaining autonomy while avoiding being completely absorbed by either power. This delicate political balance was made more dangerous by the 100 Years' War, the massive conflict between France and England that dominated European politics throughout the 14th and 15th centuries. The war had begun in 1337 over succession to the French throne and English territorial claims in France, creating a situation where every European noble had to choose sides or attempt the dangerous path of neutrality. The war wasn't a continuous conflict, but rather a series of campaigns, truces, and renewed hostilities that created constant uncertainty and opportunities for accusations of betrayal or disloyalty. In this dangerous environment, Olivier de Clisson attempted to maintain Breton interests while managing relationships with both French and English powers. He'd fought for France in some campaigns, demonstrating loyalty to the French crown. But like many Breton nobles, he also maintained connections with England, and pursued policies that prioritized Breton independence and interests over absolute loyalty to either kingdom. This balancing act was common among nobles in contested regions, but it created opportunities for accusations of treason when political winds shifted. The crisis that would destroy Jeanne's life began with the War of the Breton Succession, a civil war within Brittany over who should inherit the duchy after Duke John III died without male heirs in 1341. The succession dispute aligned with the broader English-French conflict, with different claimants supported by different powers. France supported Charles of Blois, while England backed John de Montfort. Breton nobles had to choose sides in this internal conflict while managing their relationships with the larger French and English powers. Olivier de Clisson initially supported Charles of Blois, the French-backed candidate, participating in military campaigns on that side. But in 1342, Olivier was captured during a military engagement and held prisoner by English forces. While imprisoned, he apparently negotiated his release and may have made commitments to the English regarding future cooperation, or at least neutrality. The exact nature of these negotiations is unclear in historical records, but they created suspicion in the French court that Olivier might have been turned against French interests during his captivity. When Olivier returned to Brittany after his release, he attempted to resume his previous position and continue managing his estates and political relationships. But King Philip VI of France and his advisors had become suspicious of Olivier's loyalties, questioning whether he'd made secret agreements with England while captured, whether he was now working to undermine French interests in Brittany, whether he could be trusted. In the paranoid atmosphere of wartime politics, where betrayal and shifting loyalties were common, even unfounded suspicions could be deadly. In 1343, Philip VI invited Olivier de Clisson to Paris for a tournament and celebration, presenting the invitation as an honor and an opportunity to demonstrate continued loyalty to the French crown. Olivier apparently didn't suspect a trap, viewing the invitation as a positive sign that the king's suspicions had been resolved. He traveled to Paris in January 1343, leaving Jeanne and his children in Brittany, expecting to return within weeks after participating in the tournament, and reaffirming his loyalty to Philip. But the invitation was a trap. Upon arriving in Paris, Olivier was arrested and charged with treason, accused of conspiring with England against French interests. The charges were based on suspicions and circumstantial evidence, rather than on any proven acts of betrayal. Olivier was given a trial, but it was a show trial, designed to produce the verdict Philip wanted, rather than to determine actual guilt or innocence. The witnesses were coerced or bribed to provide testimony against Olivier. The judges were appointed by the king, and understood that their careers depended on finding Olivier guilty. The trial was brief, and the outcome was predetermined. Olivier de Clisson was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death by beheading, the punishment reserved for nobles convicted of serious crimes. The execution was scheduled quickly, denying Olivier time to mount an effective defense or to appeal to other powers who might have intervened. On August 2, 1343, Olivier de Clisson was led to the executioner's block in Paris and beheaded in front of a crowd gathered to witness the punishment of a traitor. But Philip VI wasn't satisfied with simply executing Olivier. He wanted to make an example that would terrify other nobles who might consider betraying France. After Olivier's execution, his head was displayed on a pike in Paris as a public warning. His body was denied proper burial, treated as that of a traitor rather than of a noble who deserved respect even in death. His lands and titles were confiscated by the crown, leaving his family impoverished and dishonored. The message was clear. Betrayal, real or imagined, would be punished with complete destruction. News of Olivier's execution reached Jeanne in Brittany within days. The messenger brought not just notification of her husband's death, but also the devastating details. The trial had been a farce. The charges had been based on lies and suspicions rather than evidence. Olivier had been executed and dishonored, despite being innocent of the accusations against him. Jeanne's response to this news would transform her from a wealthy noblewoman into one of the most feared pirates in European history. Her grief and rage would power a campaign of vengeance that would last 13 years and would demonstrate that a woman scorned could be more dangerous than any army. When Jeanne de Clisson learned of her husband's execution, her initial response was devastating grief that would have broken many people permanently. She'd lost the man she loved, the father of her children, her partner in managing vast estates and navigating complex politics. But her grief quickly transformed into something more dangerous. Rage, directed at King Philip VI and at the entire French royal system that had murdered an innocent man and destroyed her family. This rage would power everything that followed, sustaining her through years of warfare and piracy, driving her to acts that would terrify France's nobility. Jeanne made a decision that seemed insane by the standards of 14th century nobility. She would dedicate her life to destroying Philip VI and weakening France however she could. This wasn't the response expected from a widow, even a noble one. She should have mourned quietly, accepted her reduced circumstances, perhaps tried to negotiate the return of some confiscated properties, and eventually remarried to provide security for herself and her children. But Jeanne wasn't interested in being a proper widow. She was interested in revenge. Her first act of defiance was deeply symbolic and deliberately traumatic. She took her two eldest sons to Paris, to the place where Olivier's head was still displayed on a pike as a warning to other potential traitors. She forced her sons to look at their father's decaying head, to understand viscerally what Philip VI had done to their family. Then she swore an oath in front of her children. She would avenge Olivier's death. She would make Philip VI regret what he'd done. She would become France's worst nightmare. Her sons would remember this moment for the rest of their lives, understanding that their mother had transformed from a noblewoman into an instrument of vengeance. Jeanne returned to Brittany and began the practical work of transforming her oath into reality. She sold everything: her jewelry, her fine clothes, her furniture, her remaining lands and properties that hadn't been confiscated by the crown. She was converting her entire aristocratic life into liquid capital, into money that could be used to buy weapons and ships and hire soldiers. She was systematically destroying her previous identity as Jeanne de Clisson, the noblewoman, and creating something new: Jeanne, the Avenger, the woman who would bring terror to France. The money from these sales was substantial. She'd been extremely wealthy, and even after crown confiscations, she had significant assets. She used this money to purchase 3 warships, the foundation of what would become her private navy. These weren't merchant vessels or fishing boats, but actual warships, equipped to fight and to carry substantial crews. Purchasing warships was extraordinary for a private individual, let alone for a woman. But Jeanne had money and determination, and shipbuilders in Brittany, and potentially in England, were willing to sell to anyone who could pay. Then Jeanne did something that would become legendary. She had all 3 ships painted completely black. Black was the color of mourning in medieval Europe, and Jeanne was making a statement. These ships represented her grief, her loss, her transformation from wife to widow. But black was also terrifying in a world where most ships were natural wood color or painted in bright colors identifying their owners. Black ships appearing on the horizon looked like death approaching, like something unnatural and threatening. Jeanne was weaponizing her mourning, turning symbols of grief into symbols of terror. She complemented the black hulls with sails dyed blood red, creating a color combination that was visually striking and symbolically powerful. The red represented the blood that had been spilled when Olivier was executed, and the blood that Jeanne intended to spill in revenge. It represented rage and violence, and refusal to accept what had been done to her family. The combination of black and red made Jeanne's ships instantly recognizable and psychologically intimidating. When sailors saw those colors approaching, they knew death was coming. Jeanne named her flagship Ma Vengeance, my revenge in French. The name was a declaration of her purpose, a public statement that she wasn't engaging in piracy for profit, but for a specific goal of avenging her husband's death. The name told everyone who encountered her ships exactly who she was and what she wanted: vengeance against France, and particularly against King Philip VI. It was psychological warfare as much as naval warfare, creating a reputation that would often defeat French ships before any actual fighting occurred. She recruited crews for her ships from men who'd been loyal to Olivier, from Breton sailors who resented French domination of their region, from adventurers and mercenaries who were attracted by the promise of action and plunder. She wasn't just hiring sailors, but building a private military force bound by loyalty to her and by shared hatred of France. Many crew members had their own grievances against the French crown, their own reasons to want revenge, making them willing participants in Jeanne's campaign rather than just hired workers. Jeanne established her base of operations in Brittany, using her remaining connections and properties to create support systems for her ships. She needed safe harbors where she could resupply and repair her vessels, places to sell or store any plunder she captured, networks of informants who could tell her about French ship movements. She was building infrastructure for sustained pirate operations, not just planning a few revenge attacks, but organizing for a long campaign that could last years. She also reached out to England, understanding that her enemy's enemy could be a useful ally. The English crown was fighting France in the 100 Years' War and would be happy to support anyone who could damage French interests. Jeanne wasn't selling out to England. She was using them strategically to enhance her own capabilities and to ensure she had allies who could provide refuge if French forces became too powerful in Brittany. This pragmatic approach to alliances demonstrated that Jeanne wasn't just acting from blind rage, but was thinking strategically about how to sustain her campaign. The transformation from noblewoman to pirate captain was extraordinary by any standard, but particularly remarkable for a 14th century woman. Medieval European society offered women minimal opportunities for independent action, especially for military action. Women were expected to be wives, mothers, managers of domestic spheres, but never military commanders or pirate captains. Jeanne was violating every gender norm of her society, stepping into roles reserved exclusively for men, and doing so in ways that directly challenged royal authority. But Jeanne apparently didn't care about social norms or gender expectations. She'd lost everything that mattered to her: her husband, her status, her secure future, her belief that justice existed. She had nothing left to lose except her life, and she was willing to risk that in pursuit of revenge. This freedom from normal constraints made her extraordinarily dangerous. She wasn't trying to protect a reputation or to maintain social position. She was willing to do absolutely anything to hurt Philip VI and France. By late 1343 or early 1344, Jeanne de Clisson's 3 black ships with blood-red sails began operating in the English Channel and the waters around Brittany, hunting French vessels. She wasn't interested in merchant ships or in accumulating wealth through plunder. She was specifically targeting French royal ships, French navy vessels, and ships carrying French nobles or officials. Her goal wasn't profit, but terror. Not wealth, but revenge. She was running a campaign of psychological warfare as much as actual piracy, creating a reputation that would spread across France and make her name synonymous with vengeance and death. Jeanne de Clisson's pirate fleet, with its distinctive black hulls and blood-red sails, became one of the most feared sights in the English Channel and the waters around Brittany. Her ships operated with a specific mission that distinguished them from typical pirates of the era. She wasn't primarily interested in stealing cargo or capturing ships for ransom. Her goal was to kill French nobles and officials, to terrorize France's maritime operations, and to exact personal revenge on anyone associated with King Philip VI's regime. This made her fundamentally different from profit-motivated pirates, and far more dangerous to France's interests. Jeanne's tactical approach to piracy was sophisticated and demonstrated that she or her captains understood naval warfare well. She didn't just randomly attack French ships, but gathered intelligence about shipping schedules, naval movements, and which vessels carried important passengers or valuable cargo. She positioned her ships along known French routes, used the geography of the Breton coast with its many islands and hidden coves to create ambush points, and timed her attacks for maximum advantage. She was running professional military operations, not desperate raids. When Jeanne's ships engaged French vessels, the encounters were brutal. Her crews were trained fighters, well equipped with weapons, motivated by their own grievances against France, as well as by loyalty to Jeanne. They would typically approach flying false colors, or no colors at all, only revealing their true identity when close enough to prevent escape. Then, the black and red flags would be raised, striking terror into French crews who'd heard stories about the Lioness of Brittany and who knew what those colors meant. The battles themselves were typical of medieval naval warfare. Boarding actions where armed men fought hand-to-hand on rolling decks, trying to overwhelm the enemy crew and capture the ship. Jeanne's men were apparently quite effective at these engagements, suggesting they were experienced fighters and were well commanded. They would kill or subdue the French crew, secure the vessel, and then begin the process that made Jeanne famous and feared. Separating French nobles from common sailors, and dealing with them very differently. Jeanne's treatment of captured French nobles was what created her terrifying reputation. While common sailors were often released or pressed into her service, any French nobleman or official she captured faced execution. And these weren't quick, merciful deaths, but deliberate killings designed to send messages. According to various historical accounts, Jeanne personally participated in these executions, swinging the axe or sword herself, ensuring that French nobles died knowing they were being killed by a woman they'd probably considered insignificant before she became their executioner. The personal nature of these executions was psychologically significant. Medieval European culture was deeply invested in concepts of honor, masculine strength, and proper gender roles. Being killed by a woman was humiliating, in ways that being killed by a male enemy wasn't. Jeanne was deliberately emasculating her victims, demonstrating that a woman could be more dangerous than any male warrior, that feminine weakness was a myth, that underestimating women could be fatal. Every French noble she executed was a challenge to the gender order that had constrained women like her throughout medieval society. But Jeanne's most psychologically effective tactic was her practice of leaving survivors. Not random survivors, but specifically chosen witnesses who would be released to carry her message back to France. Typically, she'd execute all the nobles aboard a captured ship, but would spare one or two low-ranking individuals, often cabin boys or junior sailors. She'd tell these survivors to report back to King Philip VI, to tell him that Jeanne de Clisson had killed his men, to make clear that she was personally responsible for their deaths, and that she'd continue until Philip was dead. These survivor messengers were Jeanne's propaganda tool, carrying her reputation throughout France and ensuring that everyone knew who was responsible for the attacks on French shipping. Every time one of these survivors reached port and told their story, Jeanne's legend grew. Sailors who survived encounters with the Black Fleet spread tales about the Lioness of Brittany, about the Noblewoman who'd become a pirate, about the widow who personally executed French nobles to avenge her husband. The stories were probably embellished in the telling, making Jeanne seem even more fearsome than reality, which served her purposes perfectly. The psychological impact of Jeanne's campaign extended beyond the actual deaths she caused. French naval operations in the Channel and around Brittany became more difficult because crews were terrified of encountering the Black Fleet. Sailors didn't want to serve on French royal ships if there was any chance of meeting Jeanne de Clisson. Officers had difficulty recruiting and maintaining crews. Ship movements became more cautious, with vessels traveling in larger groups for protection and avoiding routes where Jeanne's ships had been sighted. The operational effectiveness of France's navy in this region was degraded by fear as much as by actual losses. Jeanne's fleet also attacked French coastal positions and ports, extending her operations beyond pure naval piracy into what would now be called coastal raiding. She'd land forces on the French coast, attack towns and fortifications that had supported Philip VI, burn buildings and ships, kill officials and soldiers, then retreat to her ships before French military forces could respond effectively. These raids demonstrated that Jeanne wasn't just a naval threat, but could strike anywhere along the coast, making her even more difficult to defend against. The economic impact of Jeanne's piracy was significant for France. She disrupted trade routes, made shipping more expensive and dangerous, forced France to dedicate military resources to protecting vessels and coastal positions that might otherwise have been used in campaigns against England. She was a strategic asset for England even without formal coordination, because her independent operations weakened France in ways that complemented English military campaigns. Philip VI was fighting a multi-front war, against England in the 100 Years' War, against various rebellious nobles, and against one woman who'd dedicated her life to destroying him. Jeanne's success also depended on maintaining her ships and crews, despite not having the resources of a kingdom backing her. She needed to pay her sailors, repair and resupply her vessels, replace losses from combat and from the general wear of operating wooden ships in harsh marine environments. Some of this came from plundering captured French ships, though she wasn't primarily motivated by profit. Some probably came from English support. Some may have come from selling captured vessels or their cargoes. She was running a complex military-economic operation that required sophisticated management. The legends about Jeanne from this period include some elements that are difficult to verify historically, but that reveal how she was perceived. She was called the Lioness of Brittany, a nickname that emphasized her ferocity, her noble status, and her connection to her home region. Some accounts describe her fighting personally in boarding actions, wielding weapons alongside her crews, refusing to stay safely away from combat. Whether these specific details are accurate is less important than what they reveal. Jeanne was seen as someone who actively participated in violence, rather than just commanding from a distance. For approximately 13 years, from 1343 to 1356, Jeanne de Clisson operated her pirate fleet against French interests. 13 years is an extraordinarily long time to sustain such operations, demonstrating that she was successful enough to avoid being captured or killed, that she maintained the financial and material resources needed to keep operating, and that her crews remained loyal and effective despite the dangers. Most pirates operated for much shorter periods before being killed, captured, or forced to retire. Jeanne's sustained campaign suggests she was exceptionally skilled or fortunate, or both. Her operations during these years inflicted damage on France that extended beyond the direct military and economic losses. She humiliated Philip VI personally, demonstrating that he couldn't protect his own nobles and couldn't capture one woman, despite having the resources of an entire kingdom. She provided inspiration to other opponents of French royal authority, showing that resistance was possible even for individuals without armies. She challenged assumptions about women's capabilities and proper roles, proving that a determined woman could be as dangerous as any male warrior. The Lioness of Brittany had become a legend, and legends are often more powerful than mere facts in shaping how people think and behave. Jeanne de Clisson's war against France, while personally motivated by revenge, aligned perfectly with English strategic interests in the 100 Years' War. King Edward III of England was fighting to maintain English territories in France and to press his claim to the French throne, making anyone who could weaken France a potential ally. Jeanne represented a unique opportunity. A skilled naval commander with local knowledge, established operations, and absolute commitment to damaging French interests. The alliance that developed between Jeanne and England transformed her from an independent pirate into a strategic asset in the broader Anglo-French conflict. The exact nature and timing of formal agreements between Jeanne and the English crown aren't completely clear in historical records, but it's evident that cooperation developed relatively early in her pirate career. Edward III recognized that supporting Jeanne cost England relatively little, while potentially providing significant benefits. She was already operating against French shipping, so England didn't need to create her capability. They just needed to enhance it. Providing her with safe harbors in English-controlled ports, offering supplies and equipment, sharing intelligence about French ship movements. These were relatively modest investments that could amplify Jeanne's effectiveness considerably. For Jeanne, English support provided crucial advantages that allowed her to sustain operations over many years. She gained access to English ports where she could safely resupply and repair her ships, sell captured goods, and evade French pursuit. English shipyards could perform maintenance on her vessels. English merchants could provide equipment, weapons, and provisions. English intelligence networks could inform her about French naval movements, allowing her to position her ships more effectively. The alliance transformed Jeanne from an isolated pirate into someone with institutional backing. The relationship between Jeanne and England was mutually beneficial, but also somewhat complex. Jeanne wasn't an English subject and didn't fight for English interests specifically. She fought against France for her own reasons. England was useful to her as a source of support and as a power that shared her enemy, but she maintained her independence and her identity as a Breton noblewoman seeking revenge. England valued her effectiveness against France, but also had to manage the diplomatic and political complications of openly supporting a pirate who was technically a French subject, engaging in acts that France considered criminal. The strategic value of Jeanne's operations for England extended beyond the direct damage she inflicted on French shipping. Her presence in the English Channel and around Brittany forced France to dedicate naval resources to protecting vessels and hunting for her fleet, resources that couldn't be used elsewhere. She degraded French morale and recruitment by making service on French naval vessels more dangerous and less attractive. She demonstrated that France couldn't control its own coastal waters, undermining French prestige and confidence. These indirect effects were probably more valuable to England than the actual ships Jeanne captured or destroyed. English support also may have included coordination of operations, with Jeanne's attacks timed to coincide with or complement English military campaigns. If England was planning a landing or campaign in Brittany or Normandy, Having Jeanne disrupt French naval movements and supply lines would enhance English chances of success. If English forces needed to transport troops or supplies across the Channel, having Jeanne occupy French naval attention elsewhere would make those movements safer. The level of coordination isn't well documented, but the strategic alignment suggests at least some communication and planning. Jeanne's base of operations shifted to include English-controlled territories, particularly in Brittany, where the civil war over ducal succession had created zones controlled by the English-backed claimant John de Montfort. She may have used ports in English-held parts of Brittany as forward bases, allowing her to operate closer to French targets while having relatively secure positions to return to. This access to Breton ports was crucial because Brittany's complex coastline, with numerous islands, coves, and inlets, provided ideal conditions for pirate operations, places to hide, ambush points, and escape routes. The alliance also provided Jeanne with additional military resources beyond what she could afford individually. English soldiers or marines may have served aboard her ships, bringing military expertise and additional manpower. English naval vessels may have coordinated with her fleet for larger operations against French targets. English weapons and equipment would have been available, ensuring her crews were well armed with the best available technology. These enhancements made Jeanne's fleet more formidable than it could have been as a purely independent operation. But the English alliance also created complications and limitations for Jeanne. She had to balance her independence with the need to maintain English support, which meant she couldn't entirely ignore English interests or requests. If England negotiated truces with France, Jeanne would face pressure to reduce her operations, even though her personal vendetta against Philip VI didn't depend on formal state of war or peace. If English priorities shifted, Jeanne might lose support she'd come to depend on. The alliance provided crucial benefits, but also created dependencies that could constrain her freedom of action. There's also the question of how Jeanne was perceived in England. Was she seen as a useful ally, a romantic figure seeking justified revenge, or a dangerous criminal who happened to be targeting England's enemy? English nobility might have admired her determination and effectiveness, while also being uncomfortable with the precedent of a woman operating independently as a military commander and pirate. English society had its own gender norms and expectations about proper female behavior, and Jeanne violated those as thoroughly as she violated French norms. The propaganda value of Jeanne's story for English purposes was significant. She could be portrayed as a victim of French injustice, a noblewoman whose husband had been murdered by a tyrannical king, someone forced to take up arms in pursuit of justice that French institutions had denied her. This narrative supported English claims that French rule was unjust and tyrannical, that Philip VI was a cruel king who persecuted innocents, that English intervention in France was justified to protect people from French oppression. Jeanne became a character in English propaganda without necessarily intending to be. Jeanne's operations during this period of English alliance were probably at their most effective and extensive. She had better resources, better intelligence, more secure bases, and the backing of a major power. Her fleet may have grown beyond the original 3 ships as she captured French vessels and converted them to her own use, or as English support allowed her to purchase or commission additional ships. She could operate more boldly, taking on larger targets and ranging more widely, because she had safe ports to retreat to and resources to repair damage. The alliance also connected Jeanne to broader networks of people opposing French interests: other pirates, privateers, rebellious nobles, English agents. She became part of a loose coalition of forces all working against France from different motivations, but with complementary effects. This network provided additional intelligence, potential coordination of operations, and mutual support that enhanced everyone's effectiveness. Jeanne was no longer just one widow seeking revenge, but a significant player in the complex political and military landscape of 14th century northwestern Europe. But throughout this alliance, Jeanne apparently maintained her primary focus on revenge against Philip VI personally, and against French nobles who'd supported or benefited from her husband's execution. She wasn't fighting for England or for abstract political principles, but for very personal reasons that happened to align with English interests. This personal motivation, combined with her willingness to personally participate in violence, made her more committed and arguably more dangerous than someone fighting for more conventional political or economic motives. She had nothing to gain except satisfaction of seeing her enemies suffer, and that made her unpredictable and relentless in ways that terrified her targets. While Jeanne de Clisson was primarily known as a naval commander and pirate, her campaign against France wasn't limited to maritime operations. She also conducted land-based raids and military operations, demonstrating that her strategic understanding extended beyond naval warfare and that she was willing to personally participate in combat, regardless of whether it occurred on ship decks or on land. These land operations expanded her campaign against France and demonstrated her versatility as a military commander in an era when women were excluded from such roles. The coastal raids Jeanne conducted served multiple purposes. They allowed her to strike targets that couldn't be reached by ships alone. They provided opportunities to resupply her forces with provisions and equipment seized from French positions. They demonstrated that nowhere along the Breton and Norman coasts was safe from her revenge. And they allowed her to personally confront and punish French officials and nobles who'd supported Philip VI. These weren't random pirate raids for plunder, but targeted military operations designed to damage specific French interests and to exact personal vengeance. Historical accounts suggest that Jeanne personally participated in these land operations, wearing armor and carrying weapons, leading her forces in attacks on French positions. For a 14th century woman to engage in physical combat was extraordinary and violated every gender norm of the era. Medieval European culture viewed warfare as exclusively masculine, with women's roles limited to supporting men through managing households and providing moral and spiritual support. Women who fought were seen as unnatural, monstrous aberrations who'd violated divine and natural law about proper gender roles. But Jeanne apparently didn't care about these norms or about how her behavior would be perceived. She'd already been labeled a criminal pirate by France, already had her properties confiscated and her family dishonored, already had nothing left to lose in terms of reputation or social standing. Fighting personally allowed her to express her rage physically, to directly kill people she blamed for Olivier's death, to demonstrate that she was actively pursuing revenge rather than just commanding others to do so. Her personal participation made her campaign more intensely personal and probably more psychologically satisfying for someone motivated by grief and rage. The targets of Jeanne's land raids were carefully chosen to maximize symbolic and practical impact. She attacked coastal fortifications that had supported French royal authority in Brittany, demonstrating that these positions couldn't protect their defenders from her revenge. She targeted estates and properties belonging to nobles who'd participated in or profited from Olivier's trial and execution, making clear that she remembered who was responsible and would punish them individually. She struck at ports and facilities that supported French naval operations, degrading France's ability to hunt for her fleet or to protect their shipping. Some accounts describe Jeanne attacking and destroying villages and towns that had supported French interests, though these accounts need to be treated cautiously, because medieval chroniclers often exaggerated violence, and because French sources had obvious reasons to portray Jeanne as a monster. What's clear is that her land operations caused significant damage and created terror among French coastal populations, who recognized that the Lioness of Brittany could strike anywhere along the coast, and that there was minimal protection available against her raids. One particularly notable aspect of Jeanne's land operations was her targeting of specific individuals: French officials, judges, witnesses who'd participated in Olivier's trial and execution. Medieval justice was highly personal, and Jeanne's revenge was equally personal. She apparently maintained lists, or at least clear memories, of who had contributed to her husband's death, and she sought them out individually for execution. This wasn't indiscriminate violence, but targeted killing of people she held personally responsible, making it a form of private justice or revenge rather than just military operations. The executions Jeanne carried out during land raids followed similar patterns to her naval executions. French nobles and officials were killed, often in ways designed to humiliate them and to send messages to others. Common soldiers or servants who weren't personally responsible for Olivier's death were often spared, demonstrating that Jeanne was making distinctions based on responsibility and status rather than just killing everyone she encountered. This selective violence made her campaign more defensible as revenge, rather than just indiscriminate piracy and warfare. Jeanne's ability to conduct successful land operations required military skills beyond what would be expected of a 14th-century noblewoman. She needed to plan attacks, coordinate forces, understand tactics for assaulting fortified positions, manage logistics of moving troops and supplies, and command fighters in actual combat. Where she acquired these skills isn't entirely clear. She may have learned from military officers in her service, may have gained knowledge from her years married to Olivier, who was an experienced military commander, or may have simply been naturally talented at military leadership. Whatever the source, she demonstrated genuine competence at warfare. The land operations also required Jeanne to maintain military forces beyond just ship crews. She needed soldiers who could fight on land, officers who understood land warfare, possibly cavalry for mobility, siege equipment for attacking fortifications. This required additional resources beyond what naval operations demanded and demonstrates the scale of Jeanne's overall military campaign. She wasn't just running a small pirate operation, but was conducting what amounted to a private war against France, operating both at sea and on land. The impact of these combined land and naval operations was to make large portions of the Breton and Norman coasts effectively ungovernable by France. French authority depended on ability to protect subjects and maintain order, but in regions where Jeanne operated, the French crown couldn't provide that protection. Local populations might nominally accept French authority, but couldn't rely on French protection against Jeanne's raids. This erosion of effective French control was strategically valuable to England, and was personally satisfying to Jeanne as revenge against Philip VI. French responses to Jeanne's operations included military campaigns to hunt her down, rewards offered for her capture or death, and attempts to strengthen coastal defenses against her raids. But these measures were largely ineffective. Jeanne knew the Breton coast intimately, had support from local populations who resented French rule, could retreat to English-controlled territories or to her ships when French forces approached, and was operating with better intelligence about French movements than France had about hers. She was running successful guerrilla operations that exploited her advantages while avoiding direct confrontation with superior French forces. The psychological impact of Jeanne's land and sea operations combined was to create a pervasive sense that the Lioness of Brittany could strike anywhere, anytime, and that no French noble or official was safe from her revenge. This fear degraded French morale, made recruitment more difficult, complicated French military operations in the region, and generally weakened France's position in Brittany. Jeanne had become a strategic problem that France struggled to solve, despite having vastly superior resources compared to one widow commanding a small fleet and limited ground forces. There were probably limits to Jeanne's land operations that historical sources don't fully capture. She couldn't sustain long campaigns deep into French territory, couldn't attack well-defended major cities, couldn't face large French armies in open battle. Her strength was in mobility, surprise, local knowledge, and willingness to take risks that more conventional forces wouldn't. She was essentially running what modern military doctrine would call asymmetric warfare, using unconventional tactics to offset French advantages in resources and manpower. The combination of land and naval operations also demonstrated Jeanne's strategic sophistication. She wasn't just blindly attacking French targets, but was conducting a coherent campaign designed to damage France's position in Brittany, to exact personal revenge, and to maintain her own operations despite French efforts to suppress her. She understood how to use different military capabilities in complementary ways, how to exploit the geography and politics of the region, and how to sustain operations over many years despite being massively outmatched in conventional military terms. For all of Jeanne de Clisson's success in striking at French interests and exacting revenge for her husband's death, she wasn't immune to the dangers and losses that characterized medieval warfare and piracy. The sea was dangerous even without enemies. Storms could destroy even well-built ships, and battles sometimes went badly despite good planning and skilled crews. Jeanne would experience devastating personal losses during her years as a pirate, losses that demonstrated the costs of her campaign, even as they intensified her determination to continue her revenge. The exact sequence and dating of events during Jeanne's middle years as a pirate aren't completely clear in historical sources, but what's certain is that she experienced military defeats and personal tragedies that would have broken most people's will to continue. French naval forces hunted for her fleet constantly, and eventually they achieved some successes in engagements with her ships. Jeanne lost vessels to French attacks, lost crew members in battles, faced situations where she had to retreat rather than risk total destruction of her fleet. One of the most devastating events in Jeanne's pirate career occurred when her fleet was caught in a major storm in the English Channel. Medieval ships were vulnerable to storms. They were wooden vessels powered by sail and oar, without modern navigation equipment, weather forecasting, or the structural engineering that makes modern ships relatively safe in rough seas. When major storms struck, ships could be driven onto rocks, could founder and sink, could be separated and lost. Jeanne's fleet encountered one of these catastrophic storms, and the results were disastrous. According to various historical accounts, at least one of Jeanne's ships sank during this storm, possibly more. The flagship that had been her primary vessel may have been lost or severely damaged. Crew members drowned or died from exposure. Jeanne herself barely survived, reportedly spending days clinging to wreckage in the cold waters of the Channel before being rescued. This survival itself was remarkable. Most people in similar situations died from hypothermia, drowning, or dehydration. That Jeanne survived suggests both good fortune and extraordinary physical resilience. But the most devastating loss from this disaster was personal. One of Jeanne's sons died during the storm, reportedly dying in her arms while they waited for rescue that seemed like it might never come. Historical sources don't provide clear details about which son this was or the exact circumstances of his death, but the emotional impact on Jeanne must have been catastrophic. She'd already lost her husband to Philip VI's injustice. Now she'd lost a child while pursuing her campaign of revenge, making the personal cost of her vendetta even more terrible. For many people, such a loss would have been a breaking point, a moment to question whether revenge was worth the cost, whether continuing a war against France was serving any purpose beyond accumulating more grief. A mother who'd lost both husband and child might reasonably decide that preserving her remaining children was more important than pursuing vengeance, that it was time to stop fighting and try to build some kind of stable life for her surviving family. But Jeanne's response to this tragedy was apparently the opposite. Rather than breaking her will, it seems to have intensified her rage and her determination to continue. This response reveals something important about Jeanne's psychology and about how trauma and loss can shape behavior in complex ways. She'd organized her entire life around revenge for Olivier's death, had spent years defining herself as the Lioness of Brittany, seeking vengeance against France.
Losing a child in pursuit of that vengeance created a psychological trap.
If she stopped now, then her son's death would be meaningless, just a random tragedy. But if she continued and eventually destroyed Philip VI, or died trying, then her son's death could be seen as a sacrifice in pursuit of justice. Continuing the vendetta gave meaning to her losses in ways that stopping couldn't. The loss also eliminated any possibility of reconciliation with France or of returning to a normal aristocratic life. Even if Jeanne had wanted to negotiate some kind of peace or to reclaim her properties and status, the years of piracy had made that impossible. She'd killed too many French nobles, destroyed too much French property, created too much embarrassment for Philip VI. And now she'd lost a child in pursuit of revenge, creating a new reason for rage that compounded the original injury of Olivier's execution. She was trapped in a cycle of violence and loss that could only end in victory, death, or complete exhaustion. After recovering from the storm disaster, Jeanne set about rebuilding her fleet and her forces. This required returning to English-controlled territories, obtaining new ships to replace those lost in the storm, recruiting new crew members to replace those who died, and re-establishing her operations. That she was able to do this demonstrates both her access to resources and her determination. Most pirates who suffered such devastating losses would simply have given up, unable or unwilling to start over. But Jeanne treated the setback as temporary, maintaining her focus on her ultimate goal of revenge. The rebuilt fleet may have been smaller than what Jeanne had commanded before the storm, but it was apparently still effective. She resumed operations against French shipping and coastal positions, continuing to attack French nobles and officials, maintaining the campaign of terror that had made her famous. If anything,
Her operations may have become more vicious and more personally directed after the loss of her son, driven by compounded grief that demanded expression through violence against those she blamed for her accumulated losses. There's some indication in historical sources that Jeanne's later operations were characterized by even less mercy than her earlier campaigns, though it's hard to verify this given the limited and potentially biased sources. But it would make psychological sense. Someone who'd lost both husband and child would have less emotional capacity for mercy or restraint, would be more likely to see all French nobles and officials as equally guilty and equally deserving of death. The personal losses may have transformed Jeanne's campaign from targeted revenge against specific responsible parties into more generalized destruction of anyone associated with France. The survival and continuation of Jeanne's campaign after such devastating losses also enhanced her legend. Stories spread about the Lioness of Brittany, who couldn't be stopped even by the sea itself, who'd survived disasters that killed others, who continued fighting despite losses that would have destroyed ordinary people. These stories made her seem almost supernatural, more than human, someone who couldn't be defeated by normal means. This enhanced reputation made her even more psychologically effective as a terror weapon against France. But the personal costs of this continued campaign must have been enormous, even beyond the obvious losses of husband and son. Jeanne had spent years living as a pirate and military commander rather than as the noblewoman she'd been raised to be. She'd witnessed and participated in extensive violence. She'd lost people she'd commanded and cared about. She'd lived in constant danger of death in battle or execution if captured. The psychological toll of such a life would be severe for anyone, and Jeanne had no access to the kind of psychological support or therapy that modern people might use to process trauma. The fact that she continued, despite these costs, suggests either extraordinary resilience or an inability to imagine any alternative life. She'd defined herself so completely as the avenger of Olivier's death, had invested so much in this identity, that being anything else may have seemed impossible. The campaign had become her life, her purpose, her way of maintaining connection to Olivier, and now to her lost son. Stopping would mean confronting grief without the structuring purpose that revenge provided, and that may have seemed more unbearable than continuing to fight. For France, and for Philip VI personally, Jeanne's continuation after such setbacks was frustrating and embarrassing. They'd apparently come close to destroying her fleet in the storm, had inflicted casualties and losses that should have ended her campaign. But she'd survived and rebuilt, demonstrating a resilience and determination that made her seem unstoppable. This continued resistance by one woman, despite France's vastly superior resources, was a persistent humiliation that undermined French prestige and Philip's reputation as an effective ruler who could maintain order in his kingdom. In August 1350, King Philip VI of France died at the age of 57, ending the reign of the monarch who had ordered Jeanne de Clisson's execution, and who had been the primary target of Jeanne's campaign of revenge. For Jeanne, Philip's death should, theoretically, have been the culmination of her vendetta. She'd set out to punish the king who'd murdered her husband, and now that king was dead. But the reality was more complex than simple revenge fulfilled, and Jeanne's response to Philip's death reveals important truths about the nature of her campaign and what it had become over the years. Philip VI didn't die at Jeanne's hands or as a direct result of her actions. He died of illness, possibly related to complications from various health problems that had affected him in his later years. This must have been frustrating for Jeanne, who'd spent 7 years actively trying to hurt Philip and France, but hadn't been able to personally cause the king's death. Her campaign had damaged French interests, killed French nobles, disrupted French maritime operations, and embarrassed Philip personally. But the ultimate satisfaction of personally executing him, the way he'd executed Olivier, was denied to her. The question of whether Jeanne should have considered her revenge complete with Philip's death apparently had a clear answer. She continued her pirate operations after 1350, suggesting that either she didn't consider natural death an adequate revenge, or that her campaign had evolved beyond just punishing Philip personally, or that she'd become so invested in her identity as the Lioness of Brittany that she couldn't imagine stopping, even when her original goal had been achieved. The continuation demonstrates that Jeanne's motivations were more complex than pure revenge against one man. Philip VI was succeeded by his son, John II, who inherited not just the French throne, but also all the problems that had characterized Philip's reign: the ongoing war with England, financial difficulties, noble rebellions, and the persistent problem of Jeanne de Clisson's pirate fleet operating with impunity in what should have been French-controlled waters. For John II, Jeanne represented both a practical military problem and a symbolic challenge to royal authority. If one widow could wage war against France for years without being stopped, what did that say about French power and the king's ability to protect his subjects? Jeanne's continued operations after Philip's death suggest that her campaign had expanded beyond personal revenge into something broader. She'd spent years fighting France, building alliances with England, commanding forces against French interests. She'd become a military commander and a political actor in the broader conflict between France and England. Her operations served English strategic interests, regardless of whether they also served her personal revenge. She may have developed relationships and commitments that made simple retirement impossible, even if she'd wanted to stop. There's also the practical question of what Jeanne would do if she stopped being a pirate. She'd sold most of her properties to fund her campaign, had lost her status as a French noblewoman when she turned to piracy, had spent years living a life completely incompatible with returning to conventional aristocratic society. Even if John II had been willing to pardon her and restore some properties, which seems unlikely given the number of French nobles she'd killed, could she have simply returned to managing estates and participating in court life after years of combat and command? The life she'd built as a pirate may have been the only life available to her by 1350. During the period after Philip's death and before Jeanne's eventual retirement, she apparently continued operating effectively against French interests. Her fleet remained active, her reputation continued to terrify French sailors and coastal populations, and she maintained her alliance with England. She may have participated in or supported English military campaigns in Brittany and Normandy, providing naval support and local knowledge that enhanced English effectiveness. She was a veteran commander by this point, with years of experience and hard-won expertise in naval warfare and coastal raiding. The later years of Jeanne's pirate career also coincided with significant developments in the Hundred Years' War. The Battle of Crécy in 1346 had been a major English victory that demonstrated the effectiveness of English longbowmen against French cavalry, and that had significantly damaged French military prestige. The Battle of Poitiers in 1356 would be another crushing French defeat, where John II himself would be captured by English forces, creating a crisis for France. Jeanne's operations in the Channel and around Brittany were part of this broader pattern of French weakness and English success. But even for someone as resilient and determined as Jeanne, there were limits to how long such a life could continue. She was aging. If she'd been born around 1300, she'd be in her 50s by the mid-1350s, elderly by medieval standards. The physical demands of piracy and warfare were severe, requiring strength, stamina, and quick reactions that decline with age. She'd accumulated injuries and health problems from years of hard living, combat, and exposure to harsh maritime conditions. At some point, continued active piracy would become physically impossible, even if she wanted to continue. There was also the question of succession and legacy. Jeanne had surviving children from her various marriages who needed to be provided for, who deserved some kind of stable future rather than being permanently marked as offspring of a notorious pirate. If she died in combat or was captured and executed by France, her children would inherit nothing but a tainted name and memories of a mother who'd destroyed their family's position for revenge. Retiring while alive would allow her to arrange marriages and inheritances for her children, to provide them with some security, despite the damage her campaign had done to the family's status. Jeanne's eventual decision to retire from piracy apparently came around 1356, after approximately 13 years of operations against French interests. The exact circumstances of her retirement aren't completely clear in historical sources, but she apparently negotiated some kind of understanding with French authorities that allowed her to stop active piracy without being immediately arrested and executed. This negotiation probably involved English intermediaries and was facilitated by France's desperate situation after John II's capture at Poitiers left France without effective royal authority. The terms of Jeanne's retirement likely included her withdrawing from active military operations, potentially leaving French coastal waters, and possibly making some formal peace with French authorities. In exchange, France would stop actively hunting for her, wouldn't prosecute her for her years of piracy, and would allow her to live in relative security somewhere outside direct French control. This was pragmatic for both sides. France eliminated a persistent military problem without having to actually defeat Jeanne, while Jeanne secured some safety and stability for her remaining years without having to fight until captured or killed. Jeanne's choice of where to retire is revealing. She married an English nobleman, Sir Walter Bentley, and settled in Hennebont, a fortified town in Brittany that was under English control as part of the broader conflict over Breton succession. This location allowed her to remain in her home region of Brittany while being protected by English authority from potential French revenge. The marriage provided her with security, resources, and a return to something like conventional noble life, while also maintaining her connection to the English alliance that had supported her for so long. The marriage to Bentley also suggests that Jeanne was capable of forming new attachments, despite her devastating losses of Olivier and her son. She was choosing to build a new life rather than simply giving up after her campaign ended. This demonstrates remarkable psychological resilience, the ability to move forward after trauma and loss rather than being permanently defined by them. Jeanne was reclaiming some version of the aristocratic life she'd abandoned in 1343, though now, as the Lioness of Brittany, the woman whose legend would never allow her to be just another noblewoman. Jeanne de Clisson's retirement from active piracy around 1356 marked a dramatic transition from the violent life she'd led for 13 years back to something more closely resembling conventional nobility, though she could never truly return to the person she'd been before Olivier's execution. Her marriage to Sir Walter Bentley and her settlement in Hennebont provided security and a framework for her remaining years, but she carried with her the memories, trauma, and legendary reputation from her time as the Lioness of Brittany. Sir Walter Bentley was an English knight and military commander who'd fought in France during the 100 Years' War and who'd been appointed by the English crown to important positions in Brittany. He was a significant figure in English military operations, someone with resources and connections who could provide Jeanne with protection and status. The marriage wasn't just a personal relationship, but a political alliance that formalized Jeanne's long-standing cooperation with England and that secured her position in English-controlled Brittany. For Jeanne, the marriage represented a return to the kind of aristocratic life she'd known before 1343, but transformed by everything she'd experienced. She was once again a noblewoman managing estates and participating in aristocratic society, but she was also the famous Lioness of Brittany, the woman who'd commanded a pirate fleet and personally executed French nobles. Her reputation preceded her, making her a figure of both fascination and fear, even in her supposed retirement. She was a living legend, and that status shaped how people related to her. Life in Hennebont during Jeanne's later years would have been relatively comfortable by medieval standards, but was still shaped by the ongoing warfare surrounding Brittany. The duchy remained contested between French and English-backed claimants, with territories changing hands, battles occurring periodically, and constant low-level military operations. Jeanne's settlement in an English-controlled fortified town reflected the reality that she needed protection from potential French revenge, and that nowhere in Brittany was completely secure. Jeanne's relationship with her surviving children during these later years isn't well documented in historical sources, but we know she had multiple children from her various marriages who survived to adulthood. Some had been raised by relatives or had been sheltered from the worst of her pirate years. Others may have participated in or supported her campaign against France. Her retirement and remarriage to Bentley would have affected these children's prospects. Connection to an English knight who was allied with the English-backed Breton claimant created both opportunities and complications depending on how the broader political situation evolved. Historical sources suggest that Jeanne also engaged in religious activities during her later years, founding or supporting churches and monasteries, making donations for prayers for the souls of the dead, engaging in the kind of charitable and religious work that was expected of wealthy nobles in medieval Europe. These activities might represent genuine religious sentiment or practical recognition that she'd killed many people and should seek spiritual reconciliation, or simply conventional noble behavior. Possibly all three motivations operated simultaneously. The religious dimension also raises questions about how Jeanne understood and justified her own actions. Medieval Christianity taught that revenge was sinful, that Christians should forgive enemies rather than killing them, that taking human life was wrong except in very specific circumstances, like just war or legal execution. Jeanne's campaign against France had involved years of killing driven by personal revenge. How did she reconcile that with Christian teaching? Did she see herself as an instrument of divine justice, punishing wickedness that human authorities had committed? Or did she accept that she'd sinned, but believe the sins were necessary or justified? Or had she simply not worried much about religious implications during her active years and only confronted them later? There's no indication that Jeanne expressed regret or remorse for her years of piracy and her execution of French nobles. She apparently didn't seek reconciliation with French authorities beyond whatever pragmatic arrangements allowed her to retire safely. She didn't publicly apologize for the deaths she'd caused or the damage she'd inflicted. This lack of expressed regret suggests that she remained convinced her actions had been justified, that French injustice toward Olivier had warranted her response, that she'd been pursuing legitimate revenge rather than committing murder. The final years of Jeanne's life aren't well documented, but historical sources indicate she died in 1359, approximately 3 years after her retirement from active piracy. She would have been in her late 50s or early 60s, a respectable age for medieval Europe, though not exceptionally old. The cause of her death isn't recorded. She may have died from illness, from accumulated health problems from her years of hard living, or simply from old age. There's no indication she died violently, suggesting she'd successfully secured safety during her retirement. Jeanne was apparently buried in Hennebont, in or near the church she'd supported. The burial would have been that of a noblewoman, with appropriate ceremony and dignity, very different from the fate of many pirates who were executed and displayed as warnings, or who died at sea with no proper burial. The contrast between this respectable end and the violent years that preceded it was stark, representing the dual nature of Jeanne's life, both conventional noblewoman and legendary pirate, both respectable aristocrat and feared warrior. After Jeanne's death, her story entered the realm of legend and historical memory. She'd been famous during her lifetime, but her story took on new dimensions after death as it was retold and reinterpreted. For the French, she represented both a humiliation — one woman had defied French authority for years — and a kind of romantic tragedy, a faithful wife driven to extremes by unjust royal tyranny. For the English, she represented both a useful ally who'd weakened France and an example of French injustice that had driven a noblewoman to rebellion. In Brittany, Jeanne became a symbol of regional independence and resistance to French domination. She was a Breton noblewoman who'd fought against French royal authority, making her a figure who could be claimed by Breton nationalism and independence movements in later centuries. The fact that she'd allied with England complicated this narrative somewhat, but her fundamental opposition to France made her attractive as a symbol of Breton resistance. The legend of the Black Fleet and the blood-red sails persisted in maritime folklore around Brittany and the English Channel. Sailors told stories about the ghost ships that had terrorized French vessels, about the noblewoman who'd personally executed French nobles, about the Lioness of Brittany, who couldn't be stopped. These stories embellished and exaggerated the historical reality, making Jeanne more fearsome and dramatic than she'd actually been, but they kept her memory alive across generations. Modern historians have struggled somewhat with how to categorize and understand Jeanne de Clisson. She doesn't fit neatly into standard categories. She was both victim and perpetrator of violence, both justified in her rage at injustice and guilty of years of what was technically criminal piracy, both a faithful wife honoring her husband and a mass murderer who killed for revenge. She operated in a morally complex space, where conventional categories of good and evil don't apply straightforwardly. From a feminist perspective, Jeanne is a fascinating figure who violated every gender norm of her era and succeeded at activities reserved exclusively for men: military command, naval warfare, political leadership. She demonstrated that medieval women were capable of things that society insisted they couldn't do, that gender restrictions were social rather than natural, that exceptional circumstances could produce exceptional female actors who transcended normal constraints. But she also doesn't fit comfortably into progressive narratives, because her exceptionalism was based on violence and revenge, rather than on advocacy for women's rights or social reform. The question of whether Jeanne was a hero or a villain probably can't be answered definitively, and depends largely on perspective and values. For those who emphasize her loyalty to her husband and her pursuit of justice against a tyrant who'd executed an innocent man, she's a tragic hero, driven to extremes by French injustice. For those who emphasize the French nobles she executed and the sailors and soldiers who died in her raids, she's a violent criminal who used her husband's death as justification for years of murder. Both perspectives contain truth, and Jeanne was complex enough to encompass both. What's certain is that Jeanne de Clisson lived an extraordinary life that defied the expectations and limitations of her era. She transformed from a conventional noblewoman into one of history's most effective and feared pirates. She challenged gender norms through personal action rather than advocacy, and she demonstrated that love and grief can motivate years of sustained violence. She was the Lioness of Brittany, and her story continues to fascinate and disturb more than 650 years after her death. The story of Jeanne de Clisson resonates across centuries, not just because of its dramatic elements, the wrongful execution, the widow's revenge, the black ships and blood-red sails, but because it raises enduring questions about justice, gender, violence, and how we remember the past. Understanding Jeanne's historical impact requires examining both her immediate effects on 14th-century politics and warfare, and her longer-term legacy in historical memory and cultural imagination. Jeanne's immediate impact on the Hundred Years' War and on French-English relations was significant, though often overlooked in conventional military histories that focus on major battles and royal politics rather than on unconventional actors like female pirates. Her 13-year campaign against French maritime interests disrupted French naval operations, made shipping more dangerous and expensive, diverted French military resources to protect vessels and hunt for her fleet, and generally weakened France's position in the Channel and around Brittany, at a time when France was already struggling against English military pressure. The strategic value of Jeanne's operations for England was considerable, despite her being an independent actor rather than an official English agent. She forced France to dedicate ships and soldiers to protecting against her raids, resources that couldn't be used in campaigns against English forces elsewhere. She maintained pressure on French coastal positions that supported English control of parts of Brittany. She provided intelligence and local knowledge that enhanced English operations. She was essentially a force multiplier for England, augmenting English military capabilities without requiring English resources to create and maintain her. But Jeanne's impact extended beyond pure military effectiveness. She inflicted psychological damage on France that was probably more significant than the material losses from her raids. She humiliated King Philip VI personally by demonstrating that he couldn't protect French nobles from one woman's revenge, despite having the resources of an entire kingdom. She created terror among French sailors and coastal populations who knew that the Lioness of Brittany could strike anywhere and that there was minimal protection available. She damaged French prestige and confidence in ways that affected morale and recruitment, and that probably influenced broader political and military decisions. The precedent Jeanne set as a female military commander was revolutionary for medieval Europe, though its immediate impact was limited, because she remained an exceptional case rather than opening opportunities for other women. Medieval European society was profoundly patriarchal, with rigid gender roles that excluded women from political power, military command, and most forms of public authority. Women ruled occasionally as queens or regents, but these positions were inherited rather than chosen, and female rulers faced constant challenges to their legitimacy and authority based purely on their gender. Jeanne demonstrated through personal action that women could command military forces, could engage in combat, could exercise political and strategic leadership effectively. She proved that gender limitations were social constructions, rather than natural facts, that women excluded from these roles were excluded by custom and law, rather than by inherent incapacity. But this demonstration didn't translate into changed opportunities for other women in her era. She remained an exception, someone whose extraordinary circumstances and willingness to violate norms allowed her to do things no other woman could do, rather than being a pioneer who opened paths for others to follow. The moral complexity of Jeanne's story has made her challenging for later generations to categorize and commemorate. She pursued what she believed was just revenge for a profound injustice, her husband's wrongful execution. But she pursued it through violence that killed many people who weren't directly responsible for that injustice. She was both victim and perpetrator, both justified in her rage, and guilty of acts that would normally be condemned as murder and piracy. This moral ambiguity makes her difficult to fit into simple narratives of heroes and villains. Medieval and early modern sources that mention Jeanne typically portrayed her with a mixture of fascination and moral discomfort. French chronicles understandably presented her negatively as a pirate and criminal who'd violated both divine and human law. English sources were more sympathetic, portraying her as a victim of French tyranny who'd been driven to extremes, though even English accounts showed some discomfort with a woman engaging in violence and military command. Breton sources varied depending on factional loyalties, but generally portrayed her with some pride as someone who'd defied French authority. Modern historians have approached Jeanne's story from various angles, reflecting contemporary concerns and methodologies. Maritime historians have examined her as an example of medieval piracy and naval warfare, analyzing her tactics and operations. Gender historians have studied her as a remarkable case of a woman violating medieval gender norms and exercising power in masculine domains. Military historians have assessed her strategic impact on the 100 Years' War. Cultural historians have analyzed how her story has been remembered and transformed across time. The legend of Jeanne de Clisson has inspired various cultural productions over the centuries, though she's less famous in popular culture than some other historical figures of similar interest. She's appeared in historical novels, has been the subject of biographical works, has been referenced in discussions of female warriors and pirates, but she hasn't achieved the widespread cultural recognition of figures like Joan of Arc or Elizabeth I, remaining somewhat obscure outside of French, English, and Breton historical traditions
and among specialists in medieval history. Part of this relative obscurity may stem from the moral complexity that makes Jeanne harder to celebrate straightforwardly. Joan of Arc can be portrayed as a saint and patriot, Elizabeth I as a wise and powerful queen. Both fit into narratives of female achievement that can be celebrated without moral complication. But Jeanne was a pirate who killed for revenge, someone whose achievements were inseparable from violence and from violation of legal and moral norms. Celebrating her requires confronting uncomfortable questions about when violence is justified and whether personal revenge can ever be morally acceptable. Contemporary feminist analyses of Jeanne have been mixed. Some feminists have celebrated her as someone who refused to accept the limitations society placed on women, who took action rather than accepting victimization, who demonstrated female capacity for leadership and warfare. Others have been uncomfortable with celebrating someone whose achievements came through violence, who didn't advocate for women generally, but simply pursued personal goals, and whose story can be used to reinforce stereotypes about female irrationality and emotional volatility if told in particular ways. The question of whether Jeanne's story offers useful lessons for contemporary audiences is debatable. On one hand, it demonstrates that historical women were more diverse and complex than stereotypes suggest, that some women violated gender norms dramatically, even in societies that strictly enforced those norms, that exceptional circumstances could produce exceptional female actors. On the other hand, Jeanne's exceptionalism was based on specific circumstances that most women didn't face. She was wealthy, her husband had been executed unjustly, she had resources that allowed her to fund a military campaign. Her story doesn't necessarily generalize to women generally, or to contemporary situations. The relationship between love, grief, and violence in Jeanne's story raises troubling questions about emotional regulation and appropriate responses to injustice. Jeanne's love for Olivier was genuine and powerful, and his wrongful execution was truly unjust. But did that justify 13 years of piracy and the killing of many people who weren't directly responsible for Olivier's death? When does grief become an excuse for violence that should properly be condemned? These questions don't have easy answers, but Jeanne's story forces us to confront them. The story also raises questions about justice and revenge that remain relevant. Olivier de Clisson was executed unjustly, denied a fair trial, punished for treason he apparently didn't commit. Medieval justice systems were deeply flawed, biased in favor of the powerful, vulnerable to political manipulation. When formal justice fails, when institutions are corrupt or tyrannical, what recourse do individuals have? Jeanne chose personal revenge through violence. Was that justified by the failure of legitimate justice systems? Or should she have accepted injustice, rather than taking violent action that itself violated justice? The pragmatic question of whether Jeanne's revenge campaign actually achieved anything worthwhile also deserves consideration. She didn't prevent Olivier's execution, couldn't bring him back, didn't reform French justice systems or prevent future executions of innocent people. She killed many French nobles and sailors, disrupted French maritime operations, caused economic damage and psychological terror. But Philip VI died of natural causes rather than at her hands, and France continued as a kingdom largely unaffected by her personal vendetta in the long run. Did her 13 years of violence accomplish anything except personal satisfaction and further suffering? Yet there's something powerful about Jeanne's refusal to accept injustice passively. Her insistence on fighting back, even when the fight was hopeless by conventional measures. Her willingness to sacrifice everything in pursuit of revenge that she considered just. Medieval women were expected to be passive, subordinate, accepting of whatever men decided. Jeanne's rebellion against this expectation, even through violence, represented a kind of radical refusal
that resonates with anyone who's felt powerless against systems that seem designed to deny justice to those without institutional power. More than 650 years after Jeanne de Clisson's death, her story continues to provoke strong reactions and complicated reflections on themes that remain relevant: justice and revenge, gender and power, love and loss, violence and morality. Understanding what her story means and what lessons, if any, it offers requires examining both the specific historical context that shaped her life and the broader human questions her experiences illuminate. The first, and perhaps most important lesson from Jeanne's story concerns the power of love and the dangers of grief transformed into rage. Jeanne's love for Olivier de Clisson was clearly profound and genuine. Her response to his execution wasn't just about justice or political principle, but about the devastation of losing someone she deeply cared about. This love sustained her through 13 years of piracy, powered her willingness to endure hardship and danger, gave meaning to violence that might otherwise have seemed pointless. Love can motivate extraordinary dedication and sacrifice in pursuit of goals that honor the beloved. But Jeanne's story also demonstrates how grief can become destructive when it transforms into rage and obsession. Her inability or unwillingness to process Olivier's death in any way except through violent revenge meant that she spent 13 years perpetuating suffering rather than finding any kind of peace or healing. The violence she committed didn't bring Olivier back, didn't ease her grief in any sustainable way, and ultimately cost her a son, as well as years that might have been spent building a different kind of life. Grief requires acknowledgement and processing, not just expression through action against others. The second lesson concerns justice and the problems that arise when formal justice systems fail. Olivier de Clisson was executed through legal proceedings, but those proceedings were fundamentally unjust. Biased, manipulated, designed to produce a predetermined verdict rather than to determine actual guilt. When institutions of justice become corrupt or tyrannical, when they serve powerful interests rather than actual fairness, they create situations where people lose faith in legal processes and seek justice through other means. Jeanne's response was violent revenge, but her resort to that approach was created by French justice failures as much as by her own character. This raises uncomfortable questions about what people should do when formal justice is unavailable. Jeanne's piracy was illegal and involved killing people who weren't directly responsible for the injustice she'd suffered. But what was her alternative? Accept that her husband had been murdered by the state and that she should simply move on? Trust that eventually justice would prevail through normal processes when those processes were controlled by the same king who'd ordered the execution? The question of what remedies exist for injustice when institutions fail remains relevant whenever we encounter corruption or tyranny in justice systems. The third lesson concerns gender and the artificial nature of limitations placed on women's capabilities. Jeanne operated successfully as a military commander and pirate leader for 13 years in roles that medieval European society insisted women couldn't and shouldn't fill. She demonstrated through practical action that women were capable of strategic thinking, tactical leadership, physical combat, and all the other masculine activities that social norms reserved for men. Her success proved that gender limitations were social constructions rather than natural facts, that women's exclusion from power was maintained by custom and law rather than by inherent incapacity. But Jeanne's story also demonstrates the costs of violating gender norms in societies structured around rigid gender roles. She could only operate as she did by completely abandoning her previous social position, by accepting criminalization and exclusion from normal society, by giving up any hope of living a conventional, respectable life. The freedom she gained to act outside gender constraints came at the cost of everything else: her status, her security, her children's futures. This suggests that while gender norms can be violated, the costs of violation in oppressive societies can be catastrophically high. The fourth lesson concerns the relationship between individual action and systemic change. Jeanne's exceptional actions demonstrated what women could do, but she didn't create any lasting change in opportunities available to other women. She remained an exception rather than opening paths for others to follow. Her success was based on unique circumstances: her wealth, her husband's execution, her willingness to violate norms, her alliance with England. That couldn't be replicated by other women. Individual exceptional cases, while inspiring, don't necessarily translate into systemic change that improves conditions for people generally. This distinction between exceptional individuals and systemic change remains relevant in contemporary discussions about progress and equality. Pointing to individual women who've succeeded in male-dominated fields doesn't prove that those fields are now equally accessible to all women. Exceptional cases often succeed despite systemic barriers rather than because those barriers have been removed. Jeanne's story illustrates this clearly. She succeeded by violating the entire social system, not by working within it or by changing it to be more inclusive. The fifth lesson concerns the moral complexity of violence and the difficulty of judging actions without understanding context. Jeanne's violence was objectively wrong by most moral standards. She killed people, many of whom weren't directly responsible for Olivier's execution, in pursuit of personal revenge rather than legitimate military objectives. But understanding why she committed this violence, the profound injustice she'd suffered, the lack of any legitimate recourse, the depth of her grief and rage, complicates simple moral condemnation. Context doesn't automatically excuse violence, but it does affect how we understand and judge it. This complexity should encourage humility in making moral judgments about historical figures and about people generally. It's easy to condemn violence from positions of safety and justice, but harder to say with certainty what we do in similar circumstances of profound injustice and loss. Jeanne's story doesn't justify violence, but does remind us that human behavior is shaped by circumstances, that people driven to extremes sometimes do things they wouldn't otherwise do, and that understanding why people act as they do requires empathy, even when we condemn their actions. The sixth lesson concerns the enduring power of stories and how we remember the past. Jeanne de Clisson has been dead for over 6 centuries, but her story persists because it touches on themes that remain compelling: love and loss, justice and revenge, gender and power, exceptional individuals defying normal constraints. The specific details of 14th century politics and warfare are largely forgotten, but Jeanne, as a character and symbol, remains interesting because her story illuminates enduring human concerns. But how we tell Jeanne's story matters enormously for what lessons we take from it. Emphasizing her love for Olivier creates a romantic narrative about devotion. Emphasizing her violence creates a cautionary tale about revenge. Emphasizing her gender creates a feminist narrative about women defying patriarchal constraints. Emphasizing the French nobles she killed creates a story about the costs of injustice and tyranny. All of these emphases are based on the same historical facts, but create very different meanings. This reminds us that history is always interpretation, that how we choose to tell stories shapes what those stories mean. The seventh lesson concerns the limits of revenge and whether it ever truly satisfies. Jeanne spent 13 years pursuing revenge for Olivier's death, killing many French nobles, terrorizing French maritime operations, becoming legendary for her ruthless pursuit of vengeance. But did it work? Did she feel satisfied after Philip VI died? Did killing French nobles ease her grief or bring her peace? The historical record doesn't tell us her emotional state, but the fact that she continued her campaign for years after achieving significant revenge suggests that violence didn't actually resolve her grief or provide the satisfaction she might have sought. This pattern, revenge that doesn't satisfy and that perpetuates cycles of violence, appears throughout human history. People who pursue revenge often discover that it doesn't provide the closure or emotional resolution they expected, that violence creates new trauma rather than healing old wounds, that escalation rarely leads to peace. Jeanne's story illustrates this dynamic, even if we can't know her internal experience. The lesson might be that grief and loss require healing rather than revenge, that action against others doesn't resolve internal suffering, that violence perpetuates rather than resolves conflict. The eighth lesson concerns the question of how we judge historical figures and what standards we apply. Should we judge Jeanne by modern standards of morality and justice, which would condemn her piracy and violence, or by medieval standards, which might be more understanding of personal revenge, but which also condemned women who violated gender norms? Or should we try to understand her in her own context, without judging, recognizing that she operated in a different moral universe than ours? These questions about historical judgment don't have simple answers, but affect how we think about the past and what we learn from it. The ninth lesson concerns the role of exceptional circumstances in creating exceptional people. Jeanne wasn't just any medieval woman. She was a wealthy noblewoman who'd experienced profound injustice and who had resources that allowed her to take action most people couldn't take. Her exceptionalism was enabled by her position and circumstances as much as by her personal qualities. This reminds us that understanding achievement or exceptional action requires examining not just individual characteristics, but also the circumstances and resources that make certain actions possible. The 10th and final lesson is about the persistence of human nature across time. Jeanne lived in the 14th century in a world that was different from ours in almost every material and social detail. But her emotional experiences, love, grief, rage, determination, are recognizable to anyone in any era. Her story resonates because we can understand her feelings even if we can't fully understand her context. This suggests that while historical circumstances change dramatically across centuries, fundamental human experiences and emotions remain remarkably constant. We are separated from medieval people by technology and social organization, but connected to them by shared humanity. Jeanne de Clisson's story ultimately resists simple summary or straightforward lessons. She was a loving wife and a pirate who killed for revenge. She was a victim of injustice and a perpetrator of violence. She was a courageous woman who defied gender norms, and a person who chose a path that caused enormous suffering. She loved deeply and grieved terribly, and expressed that grief through 13 years of maritime warfare. She demonstrated that women could command military forces, and that love could power sustained campaigns of revenge. She was extraordinary and exceptional, and also very human in her responses to loss and injustice. Her legacy is the story itself, the tale of the Lioness of Brittany, who painted her ships black and flew blood-red sails, who personally executed French nobles to avenge her husband's wrongful death, who couldn't be stopped by France despite having the resources of a kingdom arrayed against her. Whether we see her as hero or villain, as justified or criminal, as inspiring or cautionary, her story persists because it speaks to fundamental human experiences and because it forces us to confront difficult questions about justice, love, violence, and the limits of what individuals can and should do when faced with profound injustice. The Lioness of Brittany left behind a legend that has outlived her by centuries, and that will likely continue to fascinate and disturb for centuries more.